welcome to the latest of our It's Time to ReWild Yourself video podcast to tie into our It's Time to ReWild Yourself set of challenges and campaign that we're running at Voice for Nature. I'm David from Voice for Nature, and I'm delighted to be joined by three fantastic guests for this version, which is our third episode, which is exploring emotion. Each month, we've looked at a different of the one of the 5 pathways to nature connection. And this month, we're going to be exploring how nature makes us feel, how we can discover various emotions in nature, reflect on them, and as a result, improve our relationship with nature. I'm going to introduce my 3 fantastic guests. I'm going to ask you if you tell us a little bit about your background and what it is that you do, because we've got 3 brilliant sort of backgrounds represented and expertise represented. And I'm also going to throw in an extra question, which is if you could tell me a recent time that you had a strong emotional experience in nature. I'm going to start with Carly. Carly, thank you so much for joining us. You're a researcher from the University of Derby in the Nature Connectedness Research Group. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the work that you do and a time that you've recently had a strong emotional experience in.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me here. I am a researcher in nature connectedness. I'm part of the Nature Connectedness Research Group at the University of Derby, working with Professor Miles Richardson and others there. And we do a whole lot of work looking at the human-nature relationship, understanding the kinds of things which lead to stronger, deeper relationships with nature and the improvement of nature connection. We do a whole range of studies that explore the human-nature relationship from lots of different perspectives, including kind of experimental studies to kind of test out different sorts of interventions for improving nature connection. The other side of that is we also work with a lot of different organisations who are interested in supporting human-nature relationships and people's connection with nature. So we offer advice and guidance and consultation around that, and also help to kind of explore how to translate the science into the real world, so it actually has a tangible impact on people's relationships.
Amazing. And it's been your work has been, I think, really helped a lot of people make sense of something which is can be a bit sort of intangible, and create that framework and evidence. So it's basically informed our whole campaign, actually. So thank you.
So the one that comes to mind was over the weekend. So one of my favourite places is a woodland that I go to, and it's very, very peaceful. It's very quiet, and so I was feeling generally very calm. Then very close to me, a muntjac barked really loud, and it must have been really close, and it terrified me. At the time, it gave me such a fright. So I guess there was particularly the contrast from this calm stillness, everything nice, and it's invigorating. It's such an airy sound, and it just really created such a beautiful atmosphere. And I don't think it wasn't moving very much, so just kind of behind the grass, just continuing to bark for a long time. So that brought me lots of joy. So the whole kind of wave of emotions throughout that experience.
That's great. Yeah, a muntjac deer sent you on a journey through all the different emotions. Fab. Brilliant. We're gonna jump to Finland. In fact, Panu Pihkala. I'm sorry, my Finnish is not great. Is a researcher, interdisciplinary researcher, exploring eco-emotion and various responses to grief and some of those more sort of difficult, challenging emotions that many of us feel when thinking about nature these days. Thank you so much, Panu, for joining us. Can't wait to find out more about your research. If you could tell us, a little bit more about what you do. And again, I mean, I don't know if you've got muntjac deer in Finland. You've got some probably slightly scarier.
Yes, warm thanks for the invitation. Lovely to be here discussing with you. So I'm based in Eastern Helsinki, working for the University of Helsinki and other projects partly intersecting with the arts and environmental research. And as you, David, mentioned, a major emphasis in my work for 10 years now has been emotions and feelings related to environmental issues. But I have a history with both practicing and studying environmental education and also matters around spirituality and nature, so to speak. And last weekend I had a pleasure of leading a hike through one of the national parks close to Helsinki. It's called Sipoonkorpi. So that was lovely. Lots of those positive nature emotions of calm and serenity and connectedness, and also some sadness when walking past clear cuts. It's always a difficult process of negotiation. These national parks, and some landowners wanted to go for it and some didn't, so there's some clear cuts right next to the border of the national park, and that sort of leads us also to some of the themes of today, but lovely to
Brilliant.
be here. Yeah, so that refers to a method of forestry where almost all the trees, if not all of them, are cut at the same time. So that usually involves quite heavy use of machinery, and then a bit depending on the method, there might be also turning of the soil. And some of these biology terms are not my specialty in English, so sorry for that, but hopefully that makes it understandable. And Finland is a very foresty country, in addition to all the lakes and swamps and mires. So the major environmental issue in Finland is actually forests and the way they are used or not used. And there's tensions, for example, inside the governmental organizations for forestry between the sort of more recreation departments and then let's make profit by timber departments. So some introduction to that.
Yeah, no, that was great. Yeah, and we do get that in England as well. You'll suddenly see this vast swathe of forest sort of that's been sort of disappeared. Awesome. Okay, and last but not least, Nicola, thanks so much for joining us. Nicola is actually one of our ReWild Yourself champions. We've got sort of 9 of them this year, people that we've picked and are championing and spotlighting their work because they coincide so well, their missions, with what we're trying to achieve at ReWild Yourself. Nicola, you're a writer, columnist, an imperfect.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, so I'm a writer. I've been writing about nature, oh gosh, a couple of decades now. So I'm a Guardian country diarist. I write for the RSPB, Countryfile magazine, several anthologies and books I've written. But yeah, it's all about, for me, the emotional connection with nature, trying to move people and galvanize them and feel the joy and grow the love, I suppose, in that it will move them to help protect it. Yeah, so that's it. I'm also I'm a climate fiction prize judge this year as well as a ReWild Yourself champion. Busy year. I'm also a school librarian, which I love. Yeah, and gosh, my emotional experience was very recently actually, and it was to do with the moon. There's always a great joy in seeing the moon. I don't know, it's this human awe thing, isn't it, really? And I'd gone out and seen it rise above the trees, and it was this astonishing red colour. We've got harvest going on around us now. I'm very rural, so we've got sort of combine harvesters going, and I kind of assumed it was that, and got all the family out. We were looking at the marvellous moon, and took photographs of it, and I put terrible photographs. I mean, my phone's very old, and I put them on social media, and it was then I realised why the moon was red, and it was the drift of smoke particles in the air coming across from Albertan Canadian wildfires.
Wow.
And in that instant, the whole emotional experience just flipped on its head. Not least because that's what I'm writing about right now. I was a cowgirl about 30 years ago, in that area, and I'm writing about my experiences then. And there was this huge sort of, my gosh, here's an airmail from Canada, as it were, about the state the climate's in. So yeah, it was a whole emotional roller coaster. awe and wonder and grief all at once, and hope, because you've got to have that. You've got to be able to do something about it.
That's such a good, another journey that you went on there with that, and it's really interesting. It leads on a bit. Carly, perhaps we could talk about this, but it's funny how your knowledge will sort of, an understanding you have about something can very much impact on your emotional response to something. Your example there was flipped on its head once you added that sort of understanding. My example quickly. I live in Abergavenny in Wales, and I used to absolutely love the hills here. They're very barren and quite sort of exposed and desolate, but I quite enjoyed the beauty of it until I read a book sort of talking about basically that they're sort of sparse and devoid of biodiversity as a result of overgrazing here from the sheep. And unfortunately now my friends come and visit and they say it's wonderful, and I look at the hills and I just think, oh, there should be trees on those hills, and a place that I used to give me great joy now makes me feel a bit sad. So it's complicated, isn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of directly our own research, a little bit. I think the thing that comes to mind is one of the bits of research we were looking at was working with the butterfly conservation, and we were looking basically if people who took part in the butterfly count, so spent 15 minutes counting butterflies, whether there was any increase or improvement in their sense of nature connection, or their well-being, and a whole bunch of different factors associated with that. We also asked about whether they experienced any the strength of any emotional response they had to taking part. So that included things like joy, and positive emotions, as well as some more kind of negative, so fear and anger. And we found from there that the stronger people's emotional responses were, even if they were negative emotions, the greater the increase in their nature connection afterwards. So that there wasn't a distinction. You'd think, okay, if people feel happy, their nature connection might improve, but actually it's even the feeling of anger can strengthen a sense of connection, and they feed into one another as well, because I think the more connected you are, the more upsetting particular things are going to be. There's lots of moments like that, because you're more aware of things, you're noticing things, you're noticing the loss.
No, and we've jumped straight into it, but
I was strongly reminded me of a classic quote by Aldo Leopold, the American conservationist and writer, who wrote that one of the penalties of having an ecological education is that one has to live in a world of wounds, roughly paraphrasing. So it's this knowledge that you've been discussing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's sort of, as you say, Carly, it goes hand in hand. You can't not, once you start to care, unfortunately, you have to, you're open to then seeing what's happening to it, and that is hard to stomach. We've as I say, we sort of jumped in. We've been throwing around words like nature connection and nature connectedness, etc.
Yeah. So nature connection, and this idea of nature connectedness, is this the sense of our relationship that we have with nature, which in itself can seem quite woolly. Well, what do we mean by that? But the research has really developed since around 2008, 2009. There started to be a growing number of studies which started to look at, okay, is this an actual thing that we can measure, we can look at closely, and so a few scales started to be developed. So within psychological research, you ask a lot of questions about people, and can you get a construct that we can understand as referring to something that we can start to look at patterns and whether or not people feel a sense of relationship. So through nature connectedness is kind of this measure of the strength of what this relationship is like, and there's an emotional element to it. So, how emotionally attached do you feel to something? So a sense of a bond with nature. There's also something way we think about nature. Do we think about nature as something separate from us, not as important as us? How do we value nature? There's elements of that. And then there's elements of how we act with nature. So do we take action to look after nature and care for it? Do we want to spend all our time with nature? So these scales help to kind of put all of these different components together, so we could end up with something that would measure nature connectedness reliably, and you could test it across different people and get kind of clear patterns. And then the benefit of that is you can start to then understand why do some people have a higher score, why do some people have a lower score, and also does it change over time? Can we improve nature connection? So once we can measure it like that, and we can have the scale that will get a sense of someone's nature connection, we can test out different ways of improving that, and get to understand it a little bit more. So that's really where the science has kind of exploded, I guess, a little bit. It started off, there's a few papers now, but there's more and more, because it's a really well understood measure that is really useful in kind of taking and understanding that relationship with nature is important, to understanding why it's important, what causes it to grow or to decrease, and so on.
And I know, with Dr. with Miles and Miles Richardson, there's all sorts of papers that have come out directly from the University of Derby and your research group, but also all over the world. You say it's exploding, and a lot of organisations really sort of interested. But is there any sort of, you mentioned some of the places examples where you find more nature connectedness or not? Is there any sort of little snippets of research you could share on some of the important factors that seem to determine whether people have high or low levels of connectedness?
There's I guess one of the things is to know kind of, I guess, patterns across the lifespan, which is really interesting. So young children tend to start with quite a high level of nature connectedness, but we know that starts to drop from about the age of 9, and then basically plummets through adolescence. So over the course of a lifespan, we get this decrease in nature connection, and it doesn't really reach those higher levels again until early 30s. So that's talked about as being the teenage dip in nature connectedness. So we know that pattern across the lifespan, where there's also been research that's looked across different countries. So are some countries and different cultures, are there different levels of nature connectedness? And sadly, the UK is like right at the bottom compared to a whole lot of other European countries and some other parts around the world. And it seems to be bound up with the levels of biodiversity in a country. So the lower the levels of biodiversity, the lower the levels of nature connection, which you might expect, because there's less richness of nature around to engage with. So yeah, there's some really kind of general patterns where you can start to look at a more kind of cultural population level about, who is connected with nature and who's not. And then you can shift through to more individual level nature connectedness. So what the people who are connected with nature, what are they doing? What makes them different? And there are some factors that might set someone on the course for a life of nature connection. So if their parents are connected with nature and they have a lot of opportunity and a kind of an ongoing attention to nature, we know that leads, you're more likely to be nature connected as an adult. But a lot of it comes down to how we engage with nature, and simple ways of noticing and paying attention to nature are really the key to having a strong sense of nature connectedness. So not spending time in nature, not going, if you go for a walk every day in nature, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a strong nature connection. If you are more likely to notice a cobweb or notice a ladybird or feel the wind on your face, it's those really simple ways of interacting with nature that we find in people who do have a stronger sense of nature connectedness. So it's a practice, a lot of it.
Sorry, go for it, Nicola.
It resonates massively. Certainly with myself, I've had the privilege of all those things. I've had parents and grandparents that took me out into what I'm going to call the countryside, and I'm very rural now, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an automatic connection there. It doesn't automatically mean there's nature out there, as in wild nature. There's an awful lot of chemicals out there and destruction as well. But I think I wonder how much it's got to do with access to nature. I'm part of the Right to Roam movement, calling for greater access to the countryside. But also I'm interested in urban spaces and how people can walk out of their front door, or if they're living in a flat, how do they connect with nature? So that's I think that access to nature, I think we're very bad at that in this country. So that's an interesting thing. I was going to say something else, but I've completely forgotten. So Panu.
Yeah, thanks. Definitely resonates, and it's a classic theme in environmental education, how to build and keep up stronger nature connections, because those are bound up with pro-environmental values and behavior and so on. And scholars have long ago found out that it's very, very complex and there's great variation. So-called socio-ecological modeling is one research approach. So trying to map various kinds of factors, ranging from personality traits to the influences of your childhood, family and peers, and some of the things that Kali mentioned, but also cultural attitudes and what goes on in the places where you live and study and work. But a sort of special issue that I'd like to touch during this conversation is that possible problem when a person has some nature connection, but then becomes troubled by the state of the world. And that's something that we have been engaging with in this so-called eco-emotion research, because sometimes it may sadly happen that people then start to go less outdoors, because going outdoors reminds them of this distress and what's going on with the modern human. Yeah, exactly so. And if I quote from my dear colleague Caroline Hickman, actually from Britain, we worked together at a large international survey about young people's climate emotions and their views about how the governments of the world are not doing very well in climate politics. But this is from one of her more empirical articles, meaning that there's information she's gathered from interviewing children in various parts of the world. So here's a quote. A number of young people told me that they no longer felt able to go and spend time in nature because it made them feel so sad and angry and full of grief at the loss of nature that it was now becoming unbearable for them. And then a quote from a child. All I see is lovely trees, and that reminds me that we are killing all the trees. And then I feel angry and sad, so I won't or can't go there anymore. And if people stupidly tell me that time in nature is healing, all I can say to them is that all I see is dying animals and plants.
Oh, God.
So that speaks of quite heavy distress. And then, of course, the challenge is to offer social support so that would become a sort of threshold and not a barrier, that there could be a sort of working through in the nature relationship.
That's tragic, isn't it? Breaks your heart to think, that's something that kids are feeling. I mean, loop back to you, Carly. So as we can hear, emotions can actually,
so I guess with the caveat that what Panu's talking about is really like you say, it's heartbreaking, is absolutely heartbreaking. And I want to avoid a sense of, well, no, if you just go and look at a flower really closely, you're going to be fine. It's not kind of like that. And I guess as they say, the size of our grief is the size of our love, and they do go hand in hand. But I think there's elements, a lot of the research comes up over and over with nature connection, is that it's about having a regular practice of noticing nature and engaging with nature on a regular basis. So you don't need to go out in the wilderness and spend 3 days, and then that would be wonderful, but it's about little tiny things every day. And I think a really simple practice is simply noticing how you feel in nature and noticing the range of feelings that you might have in nature, and that can start from a really simple kind of, if you're going to go for a walk, or you're going to go sit in a park or a garden or stand and look at a tree, kind of notice how you feel beforehand and notice how you feel afterwards. you might not notice much difference, but then you might notice, how does that feel compared to when I spent an hour on my phone or answering emails? And just that increased ability to notice what you are feeling, and noticing that nature will have an effect, because we know that often, even if we're not kind of aware of it, the natural world is full of chemicals and activities that cause an actual change in our brain, and our brain chemistry and our blood pressure, and everything starts to change, but we're often not aware of it. So this kind of paying attention to how we might be feel is kind of the key start for that. You brought up the awe walks, which is a wonderful way of bringing up a particular, awe is a really, really powerful emotion. And this is based on, there was some research that asked people to go for a walk, but to generate a sense of awe as part of their walk. And awe is when you start to encounter the vastness and the bigness of the world around you, and have a sense of amazement while you're encountering the natural world. So, like Nicola's mentioned, the moon's a really good one. It's so big and huge and so far away, and we're thinking about other people all around the world seeing the moon. But I think one really fun way of doing that is to imagine you are an alien. You've never been on Earth before, and start going for a walk and looking at things like that. So one thing I noticed, trees are in the ground. If you had just arrived on Earth and trees stay in the ground, they don't move, and then you've got all these leaves moving, you really look at them, they start to really look like they're moving of their own volition, and you can create a sense of weirdness in the ordinary world around you. And so the more you engage in that kind of practice can bring up the sense that, one way of looking at it is it makes yourself quite small. If the world seems so big that your sense of self and your ego, which is, all the things you're thinking about and worried about, and how you are, kind of becomes quite small in contrast to the rest of the world. Another way of thinking about it is like the boundary between yourself and the rest of the world starts to fall away a little bit, because your ego is smaller, your attention is on the world around you. And we know that when people feel the sense of awe, that tends to lead to a feeling of nature connection, and the sense that you are part of the world around you, you're not separate. So the awe walk's a really lovely one, can play. And I mean, most people at some point during the week will go for a walk, whether that's just to take the bins out or to go to the bus stop or to take the dog for a walk. And it can just be something to play with. And I think play is a really important part of that. Just like, okay, I'm an alien, I've never seen the world.
That's great. I know, and we all go for a walk at some point. We all encounter nature, but a lot of the time I'll realize I'm on my phone, and I see it all the time, and it's like, it's such a bad habit. But next time I look at my phone, I'm going to think aliens and put it back, and I'm going to look at the world with new eyes. I'd love to come to you, Nicola, and focus on, because it loops nicely to the practice and to the activity that we are. That we're encouraging people, the challenge that we're encouraging people to take part in this month, and that is to, let me just bring it up, to reflect and either write or record your reflections. On the natural world. And to send it to us, either sort of 80 words or about a minute of you just sort of reflecting on that. But as a nature writer yourself, Nicola, and a columnist, a fantastic column in The Guardian of, sort of the nature diaries that you do, what process do you sort of have? How do you go about? Because I've read various bits of your book and your essays and also your column, and you do explore quite a few different emotions. Do you have a process, or do you start with this literally just going and feeling, or do you go out with an idea in mind when you go out to write?
Yes, I think if I do tend to go out with an idea, I end up writing about or encountering something completely different. And even to a point where sometimes I think, okay, I'm going to write about badgers, and very lucky in that we have a badger set nearby. And if I time it right, I can go and watch them, and but actually sometimes badgers don't come out when they're supposed to. and you discover a snail on the path and you end up writing about that, or the wind, how the wind feels. So I think a lot of it is about, I recognise a lot in what Carly said actually, but it's trying to really be in the moment. And I mean, I'm a great daydreamer. I always was when I was at school, always accused of, not paying attention and being a daydreamer. But I think just letting your mind wander, and really trying to zone in with something. Senses are really important. But I love this idea of, this kind of alien viewpoint. And I use that a lot. I sort of might look at the particular colour of something. Perhaps the leaves right now, we're sort of coming to the end of summer, and the leaves of the oak tree are such a deep green. They kind of have stored all the summer in them. They almost can't take any more. And I try to think, how would I describe what that colour is to someone that might have never encountered that colour? And then you go off down a different route. If you I don't know, if you're an artist, you might describe it as a certain type of green. So I try to tap into that. So it is sort of coming at it from a completely different point of view and trying to get across that particular colour and how it makes you feel. But play is really, really important as well. And it's part of that discovering joy. I think I always remember the children. We have a little creature here called a frog hopper. Excuse me. And this teeny tiny little bug that you wouldn't know it was there unless you walk through the grass and you suddenly find, if you're in your shorts, your legs are wet and you look down and there's this sort of ball of spit on a plant stem. And actually inside this ball of spit is this tiny bug that plugs itself into the grass stem, sucks out the sap and blows out bubbles through its bottom. So the children and I used to call it the bubble bum. And we've never forgotten that. And it's just so weird and so funny and alive. And I think, it's kind of, it doesn't have to be serious all the time. And I think that that idea of play can really, really bring different things alive.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, very wise words. I think this element of play is essential and in life, and we've actually done some experimentation in Finland with clownery, and clowns usually combine both joy and grief. So that's one sort of artistic method, but coming even more to the grassroots level, so-called embodied or somatic methods, of course, which have been mentioned here, but they hold much promise. Just to be grounded and touch various things, and these are matters that psychologists may be recommending even for psychological things which have nothing explicit to do with environmental concerns, but it's still very helpful to be in touch literally with places. But then there's also a possibility to use them more explicitly for various emotions we may have in relation to the modern human world. For example, going outdoors and then searching for something which resonates with the feeling of sadness, for example, and then being in some kind of relation with that, and then balancing that and seeking something which speaks of joy, for example, or strength, and so on. So there's some of these very interesting exercises that the eco-psychologists especially have been developing.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, I mean, our emotions are so tied up with our memories and our stories and all of these things. So this is where the pathways, they do start to kind of interlace a little bit. But yeah, so like you say, seeing particular trees and particular landscapes might do the same things. I find, if I visit a place I've visited before, then often some of the feelings from that last time will still be in the space and be in the place, in a particular tree or an area where I'm in. I can bring up how I felt on that day, so even kind of like small events, you can the landscape can kind of map out emotions and in some ways. I think the other element of that, and I think this is particularly important when you can't necessarily get into nature, is how running up my words. I guess this is one of the other tips, I think, as well, is you can get into the practice of if you're feeling a particular way, what kind of landscape or space would be particularly useful for you at that time. So if I was feeling really stuck, going on the top of a hill on a windy day is brilliant because it brings everything to life. And yeah, so that's particularly useful. And then often if I'm feeling stuck, I can bring up the memory of feeling the wind and watching the birds kind of play. I mean, they play when it's that windy. They just kind of like going on the thermals, and it's wonderful. And so you can make use of that feeling, even when you're not able to get onto the top of a hill and be in the wind, but you can remember it. So yeah, it's linked up in that way.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. That's very important. I think also using those mental journeys, especially if one is unable to go on the physical ones. And one important thing about so-called eco-emotions or emotions about nature is that they often exist in some kind of combinations or trajectories. And sometimes people may have the presumption that it's only one emotion at a time, but I think that very often there's several kinds of emotional energies having an effect on us. So there might be longing, but also certain feelings of peace and joy. And some languages have words for these. For example, the Finnish language has this word haikeus, which means that there's both joy and sadness. So you are sort of sad because you know that something is passing away eventually, but you also feel joy because of its existence. So that's a feeling many people have when they watch their kids grow up. So there's both this joy and sadness. And I'd like to throw the ball to Nicola with that. So I know that many writers have done a great job in sort of reflecting these kinds of complexities and richnesses of emotions.
Yeah, thank you. I love that there's a word for that. It's yeah, my gosh, it's and I think I always try when I write, it's a real roller coaster. It really is. And I try and get all those emotions and feelings down, and I always try to end up either on a note where I make people cry. My intention is to make people cry. And sounds very mean, and move them that way. But the idea is that then they'll want to care and do something. Or it's introducing that the things can still be beautiful. Things, of course, they are. The moon I talked about earlier was still beautiful. But yeah, it's that sort of, or if you end up on a positive note, you've got hope. But it's a massive complexity, and I think it's entirely unique to ourselves, our inner lives, and how we are feeling and what we bring to that experience. I think the muntjac that Carly mentioned earlier that was brilliant. The surprise that you can actually have that sudden fear in the middle of a beautiful place like that as well. And I quite often use the idea of what I call portal writing, which is to there might be something that snags your eye or one of your senses when you're out and about. It might be a familiar stand of trees that you pass on your way to work. It might be a little weed growing up in a crack by the bus stop. It might be the rain, different types of rain. But I try and encourage people to sort of bring, I suppose, your experience to that. What memories have you got of other things that you see growing in places, or those trees on different days, different years, perhaps? so that you can almost use them to go through this door into your memories. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that the barrier, if I think quite often we approach nature, and I know we've all said this before, as something that is separate to us, and of course it isn't. We are absolutely part of nature, and I think if we try and blur those boundaries, without worrying too much about how to describe something as if it is something on itself, not connected with anything else, including our feelings and emotions. If we can describe it as something that means something to us, we don't necessarily need to know its name, the name of a species. That can come later. But, it's just sort of, well, why is it making me feel this way? Why is it making me think of a friendship that broke down some time ago? We can really mess around with those ideas and pull other things out of it. I just see it as this sort of portal.
Thank you, Nicola. I did miss some of that. Apologies.
If that makes sense.
We've got a storm coming in and we had a power cut. So nature doesn't always play along, does it? That's the other side of it. But thank you for carrying on without me. What would be great is it'd be fantastic to talk about your work, Panu, in a second. But just before we do, I wonder if Nicola, you've provided us with some tips online for how people can explore nature through writing, and people can find those on our ReWild Yourself page. Carly, there you've got various handbooks available. I think you can find it through the University of Derby and the Nature Connectedness Research Group website, on a handbook for people to learn more about nature connection. And then you've also got, I'll just bring it up here, some fantastic activities as well. We saw that all walk one. So you can find both of those through the University of Derby Nature Connectedness website. But I just wanted to, Nicola, I wonder if we can inspire people and anyone else as well with any really fantastic examples of where emotions, these beautiful emotions or difficult emotions in nature, have been experienced and expressed through poetry, through writing. You've got a couple of nice examples that you've drawn up, actually, Nicola, you've suggested. Where would you direct people for some fantastic examples of how this is done?
Yeah, I think there are some fantastic anthologies out in recent years and this year, and I think they're great because they're diverse. They've got people from all sorts of backgrounds. The ones you've got, the seasons ones, really short essays and poems from different viewpoints, and they really pack a powerful emotional punch of, you've got everything in there. The book that I've got an essay in, Wild Service, which is part of the Right to Roam movement. There are 12 or 13 voices in there, and the idea behind Wild Service is it turns it on its head. It's sort of what can we do for nature? How can we get involved and experience it, but actually give something back. But each of those essays, again, is a snapshot of different ways to connect with nature, in very simple ways, actually. And they all involve people. They involve us and our emotions. Another couple I've got here, we've got Going to Ground, which was out this year. Yep, got it up there. Again, fantastic and really interesting viewpoints as well. We often think that nature writing should be about wildness, but what does wildness mean? Wildness can mean experiencing nature, in the middle of a city. It can mean your feelings, the weather outside behind glass. It can mean your response to the ongoing climate crisis. So it really explores what that wildness means, and I think it breaks down those boundaries. And the same with Gifts of Gravity and Light, beautiful cover. It sort of explores what nature means to people. It's not in this sort of box that you have to go to, you have to have the key for, it's how we experience it. So those are those, but the nature writing is booming at the moment, and thankfully it's really branching out into all sorts of different walks of life as well. That real diversity is coming in now, which is desperately needed. But I find I've got some fantastic poetry that I love poetry, and if I'm ever stuck for ideas, or I'm feeling, I don't tend to get writer's block, but I tend to go off on tangents and I can't find the right words. But if I read poetry, I find that's it that can really move you and provoke different thoughts and feelings as well. And when I went back to university, I was a mature student at 24, went back to university, and we studied Gerard Manley Hopkins, who's a Victorian poet. But he plays with language in such a beautiful, ecstatic way. It's incredible. I've got sentences here. This is a poem called Pied Beauty. And he was a very religious man. I'm not a religious person. I class myself as a spiritual person. But the poem goes, "Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple colour as a brinded cow, for rose moles in all in stipple on trout that swim, fresh fire coal, chestnut falls, finches' wings." And it goes on, and the last line is "He fathers forth whose beauty is past change, praise him." And for me, that always meant, not being a religious person, that it meant praise just life. The variety and the magic and glory of life. And I love the way that he just makes things up. He makes words up. If you can't find the right word to describe something, then make it up. If you speak more than one language, which unfortunately I don't, introduce those words as well. And it's just, again, this idea of reveling in words, I think. The idea that I love the idea that the benefits of reading, which I'm always banging on about to students at school, they're very, very similar to the benefits that we can find out in nature and having that nature connection.
Stories help us feel
so
things
I think
that
reading in that way it's
didn't
a really
necessarily
powerful
directly
thing.
experience, but they can give us a taste of those emotions.
Yes, I personally liked Hopkins very, very much also, and the lately deceased American poet Mary Oliver is fabulous in writing about both so-called positive and negative emotions in our interrelations with the world. So I think she's great, and of course in Finland we have a lightly literary scheme, and working with some literature scholars also.
It's funny you mentioned Mary Oliver, because I know
issues,
Carly,
I
she's a favourite of yours as well, isn't she?
Yeah, absolutely. I think she's so good at capturing the emotional impact and the beauty of the world, and really simple things, really simple moments. And the joy in it is so clear. I think, the August poem that you've got up there as well, the idea of thinking of nothing, is that kind of piece that comes on in nature. But the August poem in particular just captures summer.
Fab.
Really,
We actually
it's really lovely.
we picked out
a
poem for each sort of the six main emotions, if you like, and put them online. So if people want to find some more emotions related to nature, then do check them out on our website. Yes, Nicola.
Yeah, just wanted to say as well, that Zafar Cuniel's Foxglove Country is an extraordinary poem. So I urge people to check that out. But a favourite line from mine, which I'm always saying, is that Seamus Heaney, and I think this is from about 2010, but he talks about a small quote here, but as between clear blue and cloud, between haystack and sunset sky, between oak tree and slated roof, I had my existence. I was there, me in place and the place in me. And that last line I think is such a powerful one. It sort of says that, you don't have to come from a place. You don't have to have this, you might not have an immediate sense of belonging, but you being in that place, you have a voice and you can make a connection with it. You can speak about it. I think, it's a two-way thing.
But if you can remember those lines,
I love that. I'm always quoting that at people.
Something complicated and just distill it down. And yeah, you're right. And that sense, the nature connection is also about connecting to place, isn't it? And belonging. And that's something that I think a lot of people are missing at the moment. Who am I? Where do I belong? What's my purpose? And you can find that in nature. This links. I'd love to finish. If you guys.
Yes, thanks for asking. And there's much more than I have time to say here. There is a podcast I'm also co-hosting with environmental psychologist Thomas Doherty called Provocatively Climate Change and Happiness. So on one hand, we are poking at happiness discourses, and on the other hand, we are asking the sort of deep question that what would be a good life or meaningful life amidst the climate crisis. And you can find that on all the usual podcast platforms. And we often have guests, and some of the topics are very close to things we have been discussing here, including ecological grief and the arts. We've had some poets and visual artists and so on, and we have an upcoming episode on spirituality also. It's not online yet. It partly links with my older studies. I did a dissertation about the history of Christian environmental thoughts in the early half of 20th century. There's actually folks like Charles Raven from Britain, but I'm not going to those details here. But anyway, for many people, being outdoors and in connection with more than human world manifests this connection with something larger than yourself, which is deeply meaningful. And that points to the general direction of spirituality. And then for some people it happens inside a more explicit worldview or religion or spiritual community. Nicola touched upon some of these distinctions also before. And for some people it may orient around nature. Some folks use terms like nature spirituality to point out how important nature is for the spirituality of numerous people. And then, of course, if you have a deep spiritual connection with at least parts of the modern human world, then if you experience and see pain in those networks, it's gonna hurt also, as it probably should. This resonates with what Carly said about love and care being the foundation of all kinds of emotions. And some of the very pioneering work on encountering these difficult emotions has been done by a network called Work That Reconnects, which has been led by Joanna Macy. I think she's roughly 95 years old now, a Buddhist environmentalist and systems thinker, and others. And they are explicitly framing it as something collective and something connected with our relations. And then it ceases to be an individual thing, so it also helps to move beyond overly pathologizing interpretations, because that's also a possibility, people thinking that some kind of ecological distress or climate distress would be mainly because of psychological vulnerabilities. And of course, all kinds of factors can play a role. If you have been suffering from many kinds of lacks and things in your childhood, for example, it increases the probability that various kinds of distress will be more difficult. But, for example, ecological distress and often the intertwined ecological grief are very powerful for many people simply because they have this strong nature connection or strong environmental values. And luckily, during the recent years in various environmental and nature organizations, there's also been greater acknowledgement that this is something that should be encountered together. it's not always easy to start talking about sorrow in relation to changing places and environments, for example. So there's a need for collective engagement. And some of my research, like the paper mentioned here, ecological sorrow, types of grief and loss in ecological grief, deals with those topics. And sometimes having names for various aspects can help. For example, disenfranchised grief comes from grief research and means those kinds of sorrows where you are not getting social recognition or support for various reasons. And that has often happened in relation to ecological grief. And just to point out some of the other terms, there may be tangible losses, like trees are physically gone from the neighborhood, but there may be intangible loss aspects in those events. So those trees may have special meaning for various species, including various people. For someone, it might be their childhood playing tree. So, and now if it's cut, it's much deeper sorrow than for a random ongoing person, for example. So sometimes it's important to pay attention to these intangible aspects which are not visible, but they are profoundly real. And this ambiguous loss on the left refers to losses which are unclear. And many changes in the natural world are ambiguous losses. So species, they are diminishing, but we are not sure whether they will be gone totally or not. And that's once again an example from grief research, which may be helpful then in relation to environmental change, because if there is ambiguous loss, then there are certain things that one would be wise to do, for example, trying to learn living with uncertainty and talking about it with others. So these are some of the intersections how academic interdisciplinary work
That's really
might
interesting.
then
Yeah, and so
be
I mean,
relevant for practice.
what's the first?
Well, one helpful thing might be to reflect on the various emotions which are present. There's one resource called the Climate Emotions Wheel, published last year by an organization called Climate Mental Health Network. I was part of the team, and it's a simple visualization which shows many emotion words, and it might be important to stop and reflect at what am I actually feeling. Okay, there might be sadness, but am I also feeling guilt, for example? Am I blaming myself somehow for not being able to prevent a loss, or am I feeling some kind of collective guilt or even shame because of what's going on? Do I feel anger or moral outrage, and how do I react to that? The cultural elements come into play, because in countries like Finland, we haven't been very good collectively at dealing with constructive anger. It's more been like, don't be angry in public, and then it gets, it gathers inside you, and then you explode or get cynical or something. So there's cultural layers also around emotions, and we may need to work around those. So, reflecting on various emotions and then realizing that there's also the empathy and gratitude, like very positive emotions included, and that may help to reframe your ecological grief as actually something very valuable. It's a sign that you care. But then when it comes more to the practical side of things, there's some good materials written by psychologists and environmental psychologists. For climate change in general, the Australian Psychological Society has been doing very good materials, and also some British eco-therapists have been writing about methods that might be helpful, and the somatic ones that we mentioned sometime earlier are one part of that. But also realizing that sometimes one needs a sort of healthy distance to difficult things. And that's just going to be a brief reference here, but one of the main outputs of my research during the recent years has been a so-called process model of eco-anxiety and grief. So the aim in that process was to do a process model which would be simple enough that it may be easily understood, but still hopefully nuanced enough that it wouldn't give too false impressions of very complex processes. And you can find that also freely online. So there's chronological things like unknowing, semi-consciousness, awakening, possible shocks, but the heart of the model has 3 dimensions which are called action, grieving and distancing. And so that points out that, acting on the behalf of the more than human world, that gives feelings of efficacy and can also help with difficult emotions, but nobody can act all the time. Then burnout becomes a real danger. So there's a need to encounter the difficult emotions, but also sometimes just to take time off. And if we are lucky enough that we have rejuvenating places in nature close to us, then going outdoors with good friends or just by yourself, I think that's a splendid method of healthy distancing and sort of taking care of yourself.
That's brilliant.
So that links with some of the themes discussed
Panu,
earlier.
for fleshing out that side of those more challenging emotions. It's such a huge topic, exploring the natural world and all of our emotions. It was ambitious to try and take it all on today, but hopefully we've touched on a few interesting points, and there's so much more. We've mentioned a few places people can go to learn more about this. So I'll just finish off with any sort of final reflections from you all, and then just if you could let us know where we could find more about your work, or if people are interested to learn more about this. So Carly, any sort of final thoughts? I mean, I'm getting it all starts with noticing, doesn't it, and reflecting, but is there anything else you wanted to sort of finish with?
Yeah, well, I guess it would be the noticing, and just that, maybe I'll come back, and it's not a new thought, but again, bringing back the play element of it and this kind of curiosity, which is an emotion that's part of it, and even being curious if you're not noticing an emotion, or curious if you're feeling, whatever emotion is coming up, or if there's no emotions being felt, then being curious about that, as well as being curious about the world around you. And I think, as Nicola mentioned, it's not about the names, it's just that wonder is really key, and again, repeating this idea that it's practice. If you just spend a moment, if it's just something that you spend a moment every day doing, and your mind goes there and you wonder something, or you think, oh, that's amazing, or oh, I feel a bit better, or listen, I can feel the wind and that makes me feel good, just those few seconds, just to do it regularly, to do that every day, can go a long way to both improving relationship with nature, but also your well-being and how you go about the world. So they're my take home things. In terms of finding more, so probably the best place is the Nature Connectedness Research Group page. It's about to be updated, so it will have some more details of some of the more recent work, and I'm on LinkedIn as well.
Awesome, and I recommend
if you follow
more
me there, then I post
tips
about
on practices as well. It's great. This sort of little guide that you've produced is brilliant. Thank you, Carly. Thanks so much. And Nicola, any sort of final takeaways or tips, and where can we find more of your work?
Yeah, I mean, this has been fascinating. Honestly, your work, Carly and Panu, has just, blown my mind and reaffirmed things as well. But I think for me, it comes down to the storytelling element, and how we can plug ourselves into nature and the wider world through that. And that storytelling can be spiritual, it can be very practical and sensory, and involve all those emotions. But I think that storytelling element, whether that's reading or writing, keeping a diary, jotting down notes, it's who we are, where we come from, and I mean that in all of the ways, I suppose, and what our role is. What we can do about about these things, about loss and about engagement, and it gives room for reflection as well, and or curiosity, all of the things we've mentioned. But yeah, we are made of stories. It's what makes us human, and we're going to need that resource, I think, a lot more. I've got website, Nicola Chester. I try and keep it updated at least once a month, but I'm writing a second book at the moment, and I'm also judging for the Climate Fiction Prize, so got rather a lot on. But you can check it out there. I am on Twitter, but Twitter's a funny place at the moment. I'm trying to get
Fantastic.
better at Instagram as well,
you,
but it all plugs back
into
my
the website as well, and your On Gallows Down as well. Your first book or your last book is excellent. I listened to the audio version, which was very well read as well. And finally, Panu, any sort of final reflections? I mean, it's been, it's it would probably take a whole series of podcasts, which you have actually done to explore your work, which I'll bring up. But any final thoughts, and where can people go? Is it the podcast to learn more?
That's definitely a good and user-friendly place, and I try to write my academic articles in easily understandable English, being a Finn that sort of comes with the package. And I've written a couple of popular books, but those are only available in Finnish, so that sort of restricts the readership. But just by using an internet search engine with my name, you'll find plenty of these open access articles. And as for final thoughts to this fascinating dialogue, of which I'm grateful about, perhaps, the simple message of really appreciating that one has these emotions, because the other possibility of just dissociating and numbing, that is very human, but it brings a lot of issues. So even though it may be difficult, it's actually very important that we do feel and care. And for the practical side, sometimes just asking of the emotion that, what do you want to tell me? And what do you ask me to do actually with the energy that you are bringing? And sometimes it may be to construct a memorial, and sometimes it asks you to do some political action. So seeing emotions as allies,
and actually I find that sometimes almost also seeing them as I know they're part of you, but a separate voice. I almost have different, so that they're actually mostly animals, but in my head, of these different emotions, almost having a conversation sometimes. And like you say, sort of realizing that they're allies, they're with you. You can sort of listen to them, but but you still have some agency as well. And yeah, that process that you showed us, and those importance of those three activities, those distance, action, and grief, and making sure you listen to what you need at those times is very wise as well. So brilliant. Thank you so much. There's been lots to digest. Really, really appreciate it. We will put links to all of your work on the website when we put this out as well. So thank you so much. Really enjoyed that. And hopefully hear from you all again soon. All right. Take care, everyone.